Today we come to the end of our journey with the book of Genesis. Genesis, which means beginning, which begins at the very beginning with the creation of all things, and continues with the beginning of the story of the family of God, which we've been thinking about throughout the summer. We began in June with the story of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, and the birth of Ishmael and Isaac, both children of covenant promises, through whom descendants will come as many as the grains of sand on the shore or stars in the sky. Following the line of Isaac, who married Rebekah, we heard of the birth of the twins Esau and Jacob, and their troubled relationship and reconciliation for the most part. Last week you heard of the children of Jacob and his wives Leah and Rachel and his concubines Bilhah and Zilpah. 12 sons and at least one daughter, Dinah. And last week you heard how Jacob favored the children of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin. Joseph particularly last week, the youngest of the brothers. And how Joseph was a bit of a spoiled brat and was despised by his brothers and was sold into slavery in Egypt. Somehow in Egypt he found himself becoming Pharaoh's right-hand man, second in authority only to Pharaoh himself. If you've not read this story in Genesis or seen Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, you really should. It's a fantastic story. But to make a long story short, in this position of authority in Egypt, wielding an immense amount of power, Joseph is able to save the lives of many, including those of all his family, as he, through God's grace, wisely navigates years of famine. We've been trained, really, through the simplifying of the biblical narrative, to see Joseph as the good guy in this story, even if we recognize that he was a bit of a spoiled brat when he was younger. But it means we often miss out or gloss over the complexity of the characters and the recognition that all of God's people, which includes you and me, are a complex, beautiful mixture of beauty and brokenness. Years pass after Joseph has been sold into slavery and rises in the ranks in Egypt. And Joseph's brothers come to Egypt to buy grain in this time of famine. And they don't recognize Joseph, their brother, who holds their fate in his hands. But before we get to this moment of reconciliation, which we just heard read to us this morning, I want to fill us in on what happens next, or before we get to that point. Here's the bit of the story we missed. Joseph pretends not to know his brothers. He accuses them of spying. He throws them all in jail for 3 days. He gives them grain in the end, but demands that after they get home, they return to Egypt with their youngest brother, Benjamin. Joseph has one of his brothers, Simeon, bound and held in Egypt to guarantee that the brothers will come back. Joseph sneaks the money that the brothers paid for the grain back into their sacks, perhaps as a gesture of generosity, but certainly understood by the brothers as a setup for which they will be punished if they return to Egypt. They are distressed and afraid and uncertain what to do. They go home and they don't return immediately. But in the end, when they run out of food again, they return to Egypt with their younger brother Benjamin. And this time Joseph frames Benjamin as the thief, hiding his silver cup in the sack of grain that they're going to take home. Fearing what would happen if they return home to their father Jacob without Benjamin, after Benjamin has been identified as the thief and Joseph threatens to keep him in jail. Judah, one of the brothers who first lobbied for selling Joseph into slavery rather than killing him all those years ago, steps up and pleads for Benjamin's release, offering himself in Benjamin's place for the sake of their father Jacob, whose life is bound up with the boy's life. They're afraid that their father would die of sorrow if he lost both his favored sons. And it's only at this point, after all of that arguably manipulative drama, that Joseph makes himself known to his brothers in the reading that we had this morning. And I think it's important to remember Joseph's position of power in this story. Anyone who wants to eat must come to Joseph. He commands control of all the grain in the land when there's a famine in all the world. He decides who may purchase it and at what price. Once powerless at the bottom of a pit himself, overcome by his brothers who despised him, Joseph now stands before them and gets to decide their fate. Joseph has often been compared to a Christ figure, his story somehow foreshadowing that of Jesus. As Joseph was rejected and suffers and is thrown into the depths of the pit, to be raised up and put into a position of power, to become an agent of salvation for others. And if that is in some way the case, that his story mirrors the Christ story, then we might understand this strange reunion with his brothers as his own time of temptation and wrestling, just as Jesus was tempted to power and position in the wilderness and was again tested in the Garden of Gethsemane before committing to remain faithful to God unto his death on the cross. So Joseph here is perhaps tempted to use power and position to satisfy his own wounds, to seek revenge, to express his anger and hurt. But he doesn't in the end. Wrestling with God like his father Jacob wrestled in the wilderness, Joseph chooses the path of forgiveness and reconciliation. He chooses to let go of the bitterness and the anger and the hurt, that there might be the possibility of a new beginning. I wonder what it would also mean to look at our gospel reading, just as a side note this morning, as a wrestling match between Jesus and the Canaanite woman, both learning something about God's grace and salvation. Last week, George also introduced us to Frederick Buechner's book, Peculiar Treasures, which examines the stories of different characters of the Bible in a way that invites us to relate to them as people, whose raw flesh and blood humanity just might shake the dust off us as we begin to relate to them as human beings just like us, rather than as actors in some great drama. Of Joseph, Buechner writes, almost as much as this story is a story of how Israel was saved from famine and extinction, is the story of how Joseph was saved as a human being. It would be interesting to know which of the two achievements cost God the greatest effort, and which was the one he was prouder of. Joseph's salvation comes as he wrestles deeply in his heart with the possibility of forgiveness, of choosing the path of healing over retribution. When he comes unexpectedly face to face with his brothers who tried to kill him when he was younger. Joseph's salvation comes as he chooses in the end the path of mercy, the Christ path, over the use of his position and power to satisfy a desire to get his own back. All of our actions, our words and our deeds begin in our heart and our mind, whether consciously or unconsciously. They may be born from love and grace and truth, or from fear and pain and anger, perhaps most often a combination of things. Sometimes we are fortunate to have the space and the time to wrestle with our response and to consciously choose the path of grace, of salvation, as Joseph did. And so as we reflect on this moment in Joseph's life, I wonder if we might also reflect on our own lives, moments past or present, when we wrestle in our hearts with how to act or respond amidst the complex feelings and circumstances of our own relationships. What is your wrestling match right now? Where is God in the midst of your wrestling? What is the cost? We remember that Jacob came away limping after his wrestling match with the mysterious stranger, with God. What does salvation, in this case, look like for you? Today we come to the end of our look at the family tree of Abraham. We've journeyed from Abraham to the 12 sons and a daughter of Jacob, from whom will be established the 12 tribes of Israel, more numerous than the sands on the shore and the stars in the sky. Next week, we will pick up the story of a people, the tribes of Israel, who've become slaves in Egypt, and we'll discover what salvation looks like for them and how God works that salvation among them. Salvation means to make safe, to make healthy, to make whole, in body, mind, and spirit. It means to be delivered from that which harms us. It means to be brought into a spacious place of freedom. It is God's work in our lives and our world. We see it most fully worked out in the life of Jesus Christ, whose life and death, resurrection and ascension reveals to us the path of life and salvation and invites us to follow. We've heard stories of God's salvation being worked out in the lives of Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Joseph and his brothers. What does it mean as it is worked out in your life? I invite us to take a moment of silence together, and perhaps you might like to speak to God about that. Amen.